The Great Irish Famine. On multiple autumns beginning in 1845 across rural Ireland, an invisible enemy destroyed the nation's primary food source. This disaster became known as the Great Irish Famine, caused by a fungal blight that rotted potato crops in the ground, the staple food for millions of Irish peasants, Europe's most heartbreaking diss. The failure of the potato crop alone was not what turned hardship into catastrophe. Ireland, under British rule at the time, continued exporting food while the rural poor starved. Relief programs existed but were limited, delayed, or conditional, often forcing starving families into brutal workhouses or eviction from their homes. The human experience was devastating. Families watched crops blacken and dissolve. Hunger weakened immune systems, allowing typhus and dysentery to spread rapidly. Entire villages emptied as people collapsed along roads searching for food or passage out of the country. The scale was staggering. Approximately 1 million people died, and another 1 to 2 million emigrated, reducing Ireland's population by up to 25% in just a few years, Europe's most heartbreaking diss. This tragedy worsened due to systemic failure. British laissez-faire economic policies, continued food exports, and inadequate relief efforts turned a crop failure into mass death. Political indifference proved as lethal as the blight itself. The long-term consequences were permanent. Ireland's demographic structure collapsed, emigration reshaped entire continents, and bitterness toward British governance fueled generations of nationalist resistance. The Great Irish Famine remains a reminder that when political systems prioritize ideology over human survival, natural disasters become human-made catastrophes. The Finnish Great Hunger Years. In the late 1860s, Finland experienced the last major peacetime famine in European history. Between 1866 and 1868, relentless rain destroyed crops, followed by one of the coldest summers ever recorded. In some regions, lakes froze in July. Harvests failed repeatedly, leaving grain stores empty as winter arrived early. The crisis intensified as rural populations began migrating on foot in search of food. Thousands died along roadsides. Churches and local authorities were overwhelmed, and aid from the distant Russian imperial administration was insufficient. The human suffering was slow and merciless. Starvation weakened bodies, while typhus and other diseases spread rapidly through malnourished communities. Families froze and starved simultaneously, often losing multiple members within weeks. Approximately 150,000 people died, representing 10–15% of Finland's population, with mortality rates reaching 40% in some parishes. Systemic failure amplified the disaster. Poor infrastructure, lack of food reserves, and delayed government response allowed the famine to spiral unchecked. The famine forced reform. Finland invested in railroads, grain storage systems, and diversified agriculture. Culturally, the trauma became a cornerstone of Finnish national consciousness. The Great Hunger Years stand as a reminder that even peaceful societies can collapse when governance fails to prepare for predictable natural risks. The Courrières mine disaster. On the morning of March 10, 1906, deep beneath northern France, a spark ignited one of Europe's deadliest industrial disasters. In the Courrières coal mines, coal dust exploded through interconnected tunnels, producing a massive underground firestorm that tore through multiple mining shafts. Miners, including children, were trapped as poisonous gases filled the tunnels. Some escaped, but most were sealed behind collapsed passages. Rescue efforts were slow, disorganized, and dangerously under-equipped. Survivors later described suffocating darkness, burning lungs, and desperate attempts to find air. Incredibly, a small group emerged alive after 20 days underground, having survived on bark and stagnant water. The death toll reached 1,099 miners, making it Europe's worst mining disaster. The catastrophe was worsened by systemic negligence. Poor safety standards, lack of modern rescue equipment, and company mismanagement turned a mine accident into a mass grave. Public outrage erupted across France. Nationwide strikes followed, demanding worker protections. The disaster led to improved mine safety laws and international cooperation on rescue technology. Courrières remains a haunting symbol of the human cost of Europe's industrial revolution. The Messina earthquake and tsunami. In the early hours of December 28, 1908, southern Italy was shattered in seconds. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck the Strait of Messina, collapsing entire cities while residents slept. Moments later, a tsunami with waves exceeding 10 meters slammed into the coastline. Buildings crumbled instantly. Survivors who escaped the quake were swept away by seawater. Fires ignited among the rubble, completing the destruction. By daylight, Messina was unrecognizable. Streets were buried, bodies lay everywhere, and half the population was gone. The disaster killed over 80,000 people, with some estimates approaching 100,000, making it the deadliest earthquake in European history. The devastation was worsened by poor construction standards and lack of seismic awareness. International aid poured in. The disaster reshaped Italian building codes and disaster planning. Messina stands as a reminder that nature's power is magnified when cities are unprepared. The Avezzano earthquake. Just before 8 a.m. on January 13, 1915, central Italy was struck by another catastrophe. A magnitude 6.7 earthquake obliterated the town of Avezzano and dozens of surrounding villages. The shaking lasted over a minute, unusually long, ensuring near-total destruction. Stone buildings collapsed instantly. Entire families were buried alive. Rescue was slow, complicated by winter conditions and Italy's involvement in World War I. Approximately 30,000 people died, with Avezzano alone losing 96% of its population. The catastrophe exposed fatal weaknesses in construction practices and emergency response. It became a reference point for seismic reform in Italy, though true change would take decades. The Avezzano earthquake remains a somber reminder that earthquakes don't kill, unsafe buildings do. The Titanic disaster. On the night of April 14, 1912, in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, one of the most famous disasters in modern history began to unfold. The RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious passenger ship of its time, struck an iceberg during its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. The collision opened multiple watertight compartments, exceeding the ship's design limits. Over the next 2.5 hours, icy seawater flooded the vessel. Despite being declared unsinkable, Titanic carried lifeboats for barely half the people on board. The human experience quickly turned desperate. Third-class families were trapped behind locked gates, while lifeboats were launched half-empty. As the ship tilted sharply, passengers were forced into the ocean, where hypothermia killed within minutes. Approximately 1,500 people died, while only around 710 survived. Rescued hours later from lifeboats, systemic failure played a decisive role. Outdated maritime regulations, class segregation, ignored iceberg warnings, and overconfidence in technology transformed a collision into a mass death event. The long-term consequences reshaped global shipping. Lifeboat requirements were expanded, continuous radio monitoring became mandatory, and the International Ice Patrol was established. Titanic remains a reminder that technological confidence without safeguards invites catastrophe. The Ciurea rail disaster. In the early hours of January 13, 1917, during the chaos of World War I, a civilian tragedy unfolded in eastern Romania. An overcrowded passenger train carrying refugees, soldiers, and civilians approached Ciurea station when its braking system reportedly failed on a downhill stretch of track. The train, already delayed and packed far beyond capacity, derailed at high speed and collided with another locomotive. Wooden carriages telescoped into one another and burst into flames. Inside the burning wreckage, hundreds were trapped. Wartime conditions hampered rescue efforts, and censorship limited reporting to maintain morale. The death toll is estimated between 800 and 1,000 people, making Ciurea one of the deadliest train disasters in world history. Systemic failure worsened the disaster. Poor brake maintenance, extreme overcrowding, and wartime neglect turned evacuation transport into a death trap. The tragedy strained Romania's already overwhelmed medical system and left a deep scar on national memory. Ciurea stands as a reminder that civilian safety collapses first during times of war. The Spanish flu pandemic. At the end of World War I, as soldiers returned home, Europe faced a disaster deadlier than the war itself. The Spanish flu pandemic swept across the continent between 1918 and 1920, infecting millions and killing with unprecedented speed. Unlike typical influenza, this strain disproportionately killed healthy young adults. Victims often died within days as lungs filled with fluid and oxygen deprivation set in. Hospitals overflowed, makeshift clinics were created as cities struggled to cope. Public gatherings were suspended and funeral processions became routine sights. In Europe alone, approximately 2.6 million people died, with global deaths estimated between 25 and 50 million or more. Systemic failure worsened the spread. Wartime censorship suppressed early warnings, delaying public awareness. Malnutrition and crowded living conditions accelerated transmission. The long-term consequences transformed public health. Governments improved disease surveillance, vaccination research accelerated, and modern pandemic response frameworks began to take shape. The Spanish flu remains history's deadliest pandemic, a reminder that invisible threats can overwhelm even victorious nations. The Opal fertilizer plant explosion. On the morning of September 21, 1921, an industrial town in Germany was nearly erased in seconds. At a BASF fertilizer plant in Opal, workers used small explosive charges to loosen hardened fertilizer inside a massive silo, a routine but dangerous practice. This time, the blast triggered a catastrophic detonation of 4,500 tons of ammonium-based fertilizer. The explosion carved a crater over 90 meters wide, flattening large sections of the town. Homes collapsed instantly. Entire families were buried beneath rubble. Shockwaves shattered windows hundreds of kilometers away. Between 500 and 600 people were killed, and nearly 2,000 injured, making Opal one of Europe's deadliest industrial accidents. The disaster was compounded by negligence. Long-term unsafe storage practices and the use of explosives near volatile chemicals created a predictable catastrophe. Opal led to major changes in chemical safety procedures and industrial zoning laws. It remains a reminder that industrial progress without strict safety oversight can devastate entire communities. The Holodomor. In the early 1930s, Europe witnessed one of its most horrifying man-made disasters. The Holodomor, a famine deliberately imposed on Soviet Ukraine, resulted from forced collectivization, grain seizures, and travel restrictions under Joseph Stalin's regime. Food was confiscated even as villages starved. Borders were sealed to prevent escape. Entire rural communities were left without sustenance. Survivors described eating grass, bark, and animals. In the most desperate areas, accounts of cannibalism emerged. Between 3.5 and 5 million people died, with some estimates higher. Systemic cruelty transformed policy into mass death. The famine was denied publicly, while grain continued to be exported abroad. The long-term consequences were profound. Ukrainian society was shattered, cultural identity suppressed, and demographic damage lasted generations. The Holodomor stands as a reminder that political power, when unchecked, can weaponize hunger itself. The North Sea flood. On the night of January 31, 1953, while much of northern Europe slept, the sea broke through its defenses. A powerful windstorm combined with a high spring tide to generate a massive storm surge across the North Sea. Coastal defenses failed simultaneously in the Netherlands, eastern England, and parts of Belgium. In the Netherlands, where large areas lie below sea level, dikes collapsed. Seawater flooded entire provinces in darkness and freezing conditions. Families were trapped in attics and on rooftops as water rose rapidly. The human experience was chaotic and terrifying. There was little warning. Rescue operations were delayed by weather and damaged infrastructure. In England, coastal villages were overwhelmed, and at sea, ships were lost in the storm. Approximately 2,400 people died, including 1,136 in the Netherlands, 307 in England, and dozens more in Belgium and at sea. Systemic failure worsened the tragedy. Aging flood defenses, lack of early warning systems, and inadequate coastal planning left populations exposed. The long-term consequences were transformative. The Netherlands launched the Delta Works, one of the most ambitious flood defense systems ever built. The UK developed modern flood warning systems and the Thames Barrier. The North Sea flood remains a reminder that environmental threats become deadly when preparedness fails. The Vajont Dam disaster. On the night of October 9, 1963, a disaster unfolded not from structural failure, but from ignored warnings. At the Vajont Dam in northern Italy, a massive landslide, approximately 260 million cubic meters of rock, plunged into the reservoir after heavy rain. The displacement generated a towering wave that overtopped the dam and thundered down the valley. Within minutes, towns below were obliterated. Residents in Longarone had no chance to escape. A wall of water, debris, and mud erased the town almost instantly. The disaster killed approximately 1,900 to 2,000 people, wiping out entire communities. Systemic negligence amplified the catastrophe. Engineers and officials were aware of slope instability but continued operating the dam. The Vajont disaster reshaped engineering ethics and dam safety regulations worldwide. It stands as a reminder that disasters are often born long before they strike, in the dismissal of expert warnings. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, a technological failure became a continental disaster. During a safety test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, reactor number 4 exploded due to design flaws and operator error. A radioactive plume spread across Ukraine, Belarus, and much of Europe. The nearby city of Pripyat was evacuated only 36 hours later, exposing residents unnecessarily. Firefighters and plant workers rushed to contain the blaze, many receiving fatal radiation doses. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath. Long-term estimates project thousands of radiation-related cancer deaths, though exact numbers remain debated. Systemic failure was decisive. Secrecy, delayed evacuation, and flawed reactor design turned an accident into a humanitarian crisis. Chernobyl reshaped nuclear policy worldwide and eroded public trust in Soviet governance. It remains a chilling reminder that technological disasters can cross borders long after the explosion ends. The Spytok earthquake. On December 7, 1988, northern Armenia was devastated in seconds. A magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck the region, leveling towns and collapsing poorly constructed apartment blocks, schools, and factories. The quake struck during working hours. Thousands of children were buried in schools. Freezing temperatures worsened survival odds. Rescue efforts became an international operation as the Soviet Union appealed for foreign assistance. At least 25,000 people were killed, with estimates reaching 38,000 or more, and 500,000 left homeless. Systemic failure played a major role. Shoddy Soviet-era construction ignored seismic standards, turning buildings into death traps. The disaster exposed infrastructure weaknesses and accelerated calls for reform within the Soviet system. Spytok remains a reminder that poor construction can turn moderate earthquakes into mass graves. The sinking of MS Estonia. In the early hours of September 28, 1994, a routine overnight ferry crossing turned catastrophic. The MS Estonia was sailing through rough seas between Tallinn and Stockholm when its bow visor failed, allowing seawater to flood the car deck. The ship listed rapidly. Passengers were jolted awake as stairways turned vertical. Many were trapped below deck as the ferry capsized and sank within an hour. Rescue efforts were hampered by darkness, cold water, and violent seas. A total of 852 people died, making it the worst peacetime maritime disaster in European waters in the late 20th century. Systemic failures included design weaknesses, inadequate emergency procedures, and delayed distress communication. The tragedy led to major reforms in ferry safety regulations and vessel design. The Estonia disaster remains a reminder that even everyday travel can become deadly when safety margins fail. Different centuries, different causes, the same outcome. Across famine, disease, industrial failure, and natural catastrophe, these disasters reveal a constant truth. When systems fail, through neglect, arrogance, or denial, human life pays the price. These 15 tragedies are remembered not only for their death tolls, but for the lessons written in loss, lessons Europe learned at an unbearable cost.